Where are you going to? I go to Quebec.
Yeah, don't worry about these. It should train on you. It should just go. It should be okay.
Sorry?
Yeah. How do you do it?
It should be okay. Just because like I have it trained on you, so kind of like even if I'm not here, you can still. So it's up to you.
It's trained on you.
Yeah, and then so.
Okay.
I'll be back.
Yeah, just like memorize it, but then you have like.
One side is
Tom, do you want to grab the door while you're there? Do you want to grab the door?
I mean, it's kind of fun problem solving or problem solving. It's like
that's just one thing.
Okay, so we're going to get started. This is our workshop on the International Marxist Tendency, specifically its organization in Canada, which is called Fight Back. Our speaker today is Noah Gataveckas. He is a writer, educator, and organizer from Toronto. His writing has been featured in 3 AM, Numero 5, and of course Fight Back, the Marxist voice of youth and labor. He's a supporter of the International Marxist Tendency, and in the past was involved in Occupy Toronto. His other interests include ancient philosophy, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and culture and history. Noah's going to give a presentation on the positions and history of the International Marxist Tendency and Fight Back, and then we're going to have a question and answer session.
Okay. And can you just let me know what the time as we go along?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. First of all, I just want to say thanks a lot for having me down. You know, I know last year we had John Peterson from Socialist Appeal come out and gave a presentation. You might have known about that. I wasn't even involved with Fight Back at the time, I don't think. But since getting involved, I've gotten quite involved, and ideally, I wanted to have Tom Chaudier here to be able to answer questions about Socialist Appeal, campaign for a mass labor party in the United States. I understand probably most people here are Americans, maybe that might be more immediate, but maybe by talking about Canada and talking about specific circumstances we have to deal with there, there still might be some carryover points, you know, things that'll help. But first of all, I'll just explain a little bit about who I am, why I'm here to try and talk about the INT. I grew up kind of from a middle-class background in a suburb of Toronto called Oakville. My parents were not very political, just kind of cynical. It's like, oh, the right, the left, it's all the same. They're all, you know, whatever. But I remember at a very young age, though, coming across some Marx, reading it just in the library, describing myself as a socialist in high school. Now, I went off to university at Acadia, which is in Nova Scotia, so on the east coast of Canada. And, you know, at that point in time, you go through lots of revolutions in your own personality. So then all of a sudden I found myself reading an Ayn Rand book, and I'm like, yeah. And then the next year I'm reading something else, and I'm like, yeah. And so it was really actually only after I got out of academia and moved back to Toronto that I felt like my ideological headspace kind of settled down a little bit more. And the ideas of Marxism, and particularly when I started reading Lenin, which I find sometimes can be the elephant in the room. Once I started reading Lenin, something clicked. It was like, oh, this makes sense. Just around the same time, Occupy started. In Occupy Toronto, I'm not sure, maybe people were involved in their respective Occupy movements wherever they're from. But in Occupy Toronto, it was very, the issues that came to the fore, first of all, we were ridiculed because the financial crisis was an American phenomenon and not specifically a Canadian one. So the Canadian press were like, why are you here? Move to the United States and then protest there, don't do it here. But native land rights and homelessness in Toronto became huge issues. And the camp quickly kind of got filled with these kind of issues. And so along with that, there was lots of sects. The sectarians came out, you know, whether it was the Spartacists or certain Maoist groups or the Communist Party of Iran, which nonetheless campaigns in Toronto apparently. So I got a chance to actually, just having read a little bit of Lenin, to go around and talk to all of these different groups. When I came to the IMT though, there was something that was very different. As opposed to kind of having an orientation where you're building ideally one by one until you get to like 1 million or something like that, which I feel is a very idealistic way of building mass tendency. It's not the way that the Bolsheviks did it. The difference was that Fight Back in Canada had a foot in something called the NDP, that's the New Democratic Party. This is basically the equivalent of like a social democratic party. This is absent, of course, in American politics, and so that's kind of how this difference gets structured between the Canadian and the American situation. The NDP originally came out of a group called the CCF, which in the 1930s, 1932, I think, was founded on these principles. So this is from the what's called the Regina Manifesto, and I'll just read a couple sentences from it. We aim to replace the present capitalist system with its inherent injustice and inhumanity by a social order from which the domination and exploitation of one class by another will be eliminated, in which economic planning will supersede unregulated private enterprise and competition, and in which genuine democratic self-government based upon economic equality will be possible. The present order is marked by glaring inequalities of wealth and opportunity, by chaotic waste and instability, etc. The point is that this is a rather radical manifesto, but talking about replacing capitalism with something else, not what you're used to hearing from a lot of other social democratic parties. Now, unfortunately, that was 1933. Since then, the CCF, although basically winning public health care in Canada through a kind of a difficult political situation where they passed it in Saskatchewan, and then that kind of forced the Liberals' hands, who were in power federally, to actually go forward and nationalize healthcare across the country. But overall, the responsibility comes back to the CCF. But then, in the 60s, with the big capitalist boom, they changed into a different party. They adopted Keynesian policies. They rejected their talk originally about overthrowing capitalism and things like that. And what we got instead was the New Democratic Party. Now, granted, one of the people, Tommy Douglas, who signed and helped write that manifesto, was the first leader of the NDP. So there was continuity there between the CCF and the NDP. But basically, what we've seen since the 60s is just the NDP shift further and further right. The current leader of the NDP right now in the official opposition in Canada is a fellow named Thomas Mulcair, who literally was a young liberal and even had ties to the Conservative Party. So at this point, we're in kind of a difficult situation. But hopefully over the course of my presentation, I'll also be able to explain why, despite this, it still makes sense to work in and engage the Social Democratic Party that is the NDP. So getting back to my story a little bit, what attracted me to the IMT is that it wasn't an alienating sect. It had an open door in terms of working together. For example, there were other groups out there that sent invitations out, we want to work with them, etc. But the standard response we hear from sectarians is, oh, you guys are left reformists, you're just trying to get into the NDP and work your way up or something like that. And so it was very difficult to kind of find common ground sometimes to do this. But to get into the specifics and what the IMT has specifically taught me, because I'll admit, I hadn't even read Trotsky before joining the NDP. I read some Lenin, specifically Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which is a very important book about how communists should relate to parliamentary politics. But going through and getting educated, basically, by the IMT was really eye-opening for me, because having done some academic stuff, tried to educate myself a little bit, and this is a point I'll get back to later in the presentation, organization should be the chief apparatus of education from a Marxist standpoint, not schools, not academic institutions. They can't teach Marxism. They can't think the crisis because it's bourgeois. It's a bourgeois ideology that infuses the academic situation. What was amazing is that by going and getting involved in the organization, I literally had my ideas, academic ideas that you think you have and everyone kind of floats around with. They were legitimately challenged, and it really pushed me to kind of develop my own ideas. So basically, where that starts, though, is this claim of orthodox Marxism. Now, if you've read the Platypus introductory reading group, you might be familiar with an essay by George Lukács called What is Orthodox Marxism? But I'm tempted to kind of summarize that by just giving a short equation to help us define it. So of course, Marx, Engels, Luxemburg, if you want to throw her in there, Lenin and Trotsky. The main connections, though, are these two. And the way that this kind of forms a set that is basically orthodox Marxism, as they say. What this doesn't mean is that every single thing that these people wrote is true. Clearly, that's not a scientific approach to this stuff at all. But the point is that by going into these texts, returning to the text that are written by these figures, we can still find innumerable lessons and ideas that we can apply today. I know this kind of maybe even seems, all the sectarians would say this, like lots of Marxist groups would be like, yeah, this is it, we agree. But the key is to try and approach these figures from a dialectical standpoint and understand the connections between the two. The way that Marx and Engels had primarily a cooperative relationship, whereas what we see with Lenin and Trotsky is something more akin to a competitive cooperative relationship. Like you can read even up till Lenin's last testament, actually. He's still kind of going at Trotsky and saying, oh, he's doing this wrong, he's doing that wrong. Yet, the fact is they were still in the same party, they were still working together. I guess it's just the way that this relationship, Luxemburg to Lenin and Trotsky to Lenin, gets seized on by certain sectarian groups today to try and present basically an alternative history where they're all against each other, as opposed to focusing on the overwhelming commonalities, that they share. This is, I think, what we need to reinvent today, to get away from the kind of splitting rhetoric of Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky versus Lenin, stuff like that. Don't get me wrong, you have to focus on the differences, but if we can take this kind of like equation together as a whole, like we have a very hard kernel of what Marxism means and what's involved in it. So now, the difference, you could say, between our tendency, though, and all the other groups that would agree with an equation like this, is I'd be tempted to say that there's a fellow named Tempt Grant who can kind of stand in, to a certain extent, for the whole thing. That doesn't mean that Grant is better or bigger than the rest of these guys, but it's more that without Grant as a kind of interpretive, scholarly way of looking at this group and this discourse, to use a Foucauldian term, this whole Marxist discourse, it's very easy to get lost. And it's very easy to jump to conclusions, as we see with many sectarian groups do today, about how to interpret these things. Ted Grant was born, I think, in 1913. He just died rather recently in 2006. There's a book coming out about, Alan Woods wrote a book about him coming out very soon called The Permanent Revolutionary. Kind of a lame title if you ask me. But the idea is that this guy was very consistently, over the course of his entire life, fighting the cause in Britain. And he stands apart, though, from the rest of the so-called Trotskyist groups out there, which are represented by the Fourth International, for very specific reasons that I'm going to get into. Now, maybe hands up, who here is familiar with something called the Fourth International? Are we mostly? Okay. I'll go into just like a little brief explanation of that. Basically, once Stalin took over the Third International that was established by Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks in Russia, once it was corrupted by Stalin and turned basically into a kind of institution for counter-revolutionary intrigue around the world, specifically look at the Spanish Civil War if you want to see the way that a so-called communist party can be completely counter-revolutionary in its tactics and attitudes. The Fourth International came from the need to realize that socialism has to be an internationalist revolution. You can't have an island of socialism in a sea of capitalism. Therefore, you need an orientation that takes into account international struggle. With Third International completely bankrupted, it became very necessary to start a Fourth International, and that's what Trotsky set out to do in 1938 with the help of various other organizers. Now, 1938 is an interesting year because it's really in the middle of everything building up to World War II. Personally, I kind of feel that from our own perspective, trying to look back before World War II, it's like there's a rupture that happens. It's very hard to think what life would have been like before World War II and how such radical violence that took place over the course of just those years, so much destruction of means of production of human lives, waste. It's very difficult to go back and look at what Trotsky said in 1938 and reconcile it with the post-war situation in 1945. what Trotsky said was, chances are there's going to be a return of fascism. World War III might happen again unless the Fourth International can assert itself as the leading force worldwide. And the leaders of the Fourth International, Grant's not one of them. People like James Cannon, Jerry Healy, Ernest Mandel, Pablo, there's various others. They took a very empiricist or non-dialectical approach to reading Trotsky's works. And they basically ended up saying until 1953 that World War III was around the corner, that they're in a slump. You know, that like the economy was going down in 1948, 49, 50, when really what we experienced was the biggest boom in the history of capitalism. So Ted Grant in 1946, with a few other like-minded thinkers, called it out. They said, there's a problem with the leadership here.
They also claimed China was capitalist.
Huh?
They also kept claiming China was capitalist.
Yeah, and that Mao was an unconscious Trotskyist. And like this, it seems that like, because this happened a little bit later, it's like some initial errors just got compacted, and it got worse and worse as the Fourth International went on. It split up with itself. It just becomes the sectarian situation that we have today with like Sparks and IBT and all these people just going at each other, yet they all kind of very, in a lot of ways, resemble each other, you know? But they all will claim, for example, you ask the Spartacists, they'll say, oh, Cannon was the best one of the Fourth International. And then another person will say, oh, Mandel was the best one, you know? The point is that they were all wrong together, you know? It's like a barrel of monkeys, you know? The whole thing is just going to be thrown out. And Ted Grant helps us do that, basically, as a thinker, because he got kicked out of the Fourth International in 1950. The first split that took place in the Fourth International, I think, was 1953. And Grant had basically been hitting his head against this leadership body and saying, no, this analysis is incorrect, this is not Marxism, we're approaching things from a very kind of empiricist view, but also there were organizational problems. I have a document here called Programming the International from 1970, but Ted Grant basically gives a very short analysis of the leadership, the way he saw it, and the way that they were organizing. On organizational matters, the International has been bedeviled with a heritage of Zinovievism and clique factional politics, of horse deals, of key man politics, of which Cannon, among others, despite his gifts as a workers' leader, was guilty. He also compares it to a kind of Stalinist form of leadership. Now, what is Zinovievism? Zinoviev was, of course, one of the major revolutionaries in the Bolsheviks, along with Lenin and Trotsky. But when it came to organizing, even the Third International, he kind of had a tendency where if you experienced opposition, he would say, all right, you're out, I'm going to put a yes man in, you know? And so it becomes this kind of bureaucratic way of getting what you want. Now, clearly that's very problematic, and this tended to get extremely abused, this way of looking at things by the Fourth International. I suppose there's a great irony to think that a Trotskyist group could be Stalinist or Zinovievist in the way that they organize, but that's the tradition that we have to recover from, and we really have to realize that when we deal with the undemocratic streak that we experience in other certain sectarian tendencies, what we're really dealing with is a much larger tradition that goes all the way back to the authoritarian tendencies within the actual original Bolsheviks themselves. You know, against this, of course, I'd love to look at an essay or cite an essay like Chris Catrone's Lenin's Liberalism, because it shows that, of course, like it's not the case that all the Bolsheviks were just authoritarian and stuff like that. But once you consider how Zinoviev and Stalin were very close to, really in a lot of ways. I know we always talk about Stalin, but Zinoviev was probably seen as the leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin died, you know? And he basically just kind of got outmaneuvered by Stalin and eventually executed by Stalin. But this tradition is not just, we can't see the Fourth International as isolated in history, because it comes from a tradition that goes all the way back to this, to the Third International and what happened there. But anyways, Ted Grant gets kicked out in 1950. He's in, and it's very tough to organize if you're in the middle of a capitalist boom, you know, because there's no reason for people to, there's hardly a reason for people to actually question the system as such, you know. We're talking just about like the masses, you know. So a guy named Jerry Healy ends up leaving, the Fourth International, and then so they needed a British section to fill in. So Ted Grant joins again, probably against his better judgment, in 1957. But decisively, in 1965, he gets kicked out again. And at this point, yeah, like as you said, like the contradictions of the Fourth International's views have just accumulated. They talk about how Tito is like a healthy worker state in Yugoslavia versus the Stalinist deformed worker state. They talk about how Mao is an unconscious Trotskyist who's secretly on our side, even though he just says that Stalin is great and stuff like that. So the Fourth International just seems to kind of keep compacting their own errors going forward. And when Ted Grant splits in 1965, it's final. He doesn't come back, and from his perspective, basically, an important theoretical lesson is learned, which is that too often, the left is dead weight. Too often, looking at the left out there with the kind of the feuds and the, these little intrigues and things like that, we're missing the bigger picture. Revolutionaries hardly can be said to make revolutions. Masses do. The people in the streets. And when the masses take the stage of history, they tend not to leave the stage until things have been decisively decided one way or the other, victory or defeat. This is Ted Grant's, I think, key theoretical insight in general, going forward in terms of organizing. We always have to be able to think the mass as a concept, if I want to kind of get Hegelian for a second. I think too often we just see the mass as an abstract concept. It's just they're out there. But to really think what it means, because most of us, I don't think in our lives, have ever been in a situation where the masses have truly risen up. Maybe some of us have. Chances are, based on the way that the advanced capitalist countries have been for the last 30 or 40 years, you'd have to be in, chances are, a non-advanced capitalist country to experience this. Venezuela, maybe, I'm not sure if anyone's old enough here to remember May 68, but God knows I'm not. But the point is that we can't dismiss this as a left to just focus on policy and programs of other groups and trying to unify everyone together through dialogue. What we really have to do is have an orientation that tries to activate those people who are not even necessarily political to begin with, not even Marxists, whatever. If we're starting just with a level of Marxist education, and the way that we see going forward is to just refine that, then we're only ever dealing with small groups of people. Now, don't get me wrong, it's very difficult to picture and to imagine what it's like to organize actual masses, and the way that these things develop they can be spontaneous sometimes, they can be chaotic and difficult, but without the masses, there is no revolution. It's as simple as that. And I think as Marxists, we have to kind of come to that conclusion. So what Ted Grant did after he finally, for the second time, left the Fourth International, he went back to the Labour Party. He always actually advocated organizing through just your general social democratic parties. Of course, in America, this presents a very difficult problem because there is no immediate party to go into if that's the case, but in Canada with the NDP or in the UK with the Labour Party, and there's lots of, most countries I think have a situation where there's a social democratic party. And you can look at it also in the way that where are the unions putting their money? I know in the American situation that would suggest the Democrats, but there's already too many problems with that. I'm not going to go into that so much. But he entered the Labour Party, developed a tendency called the militant tendency with the help of others. But at a certain point in time, they had fighting against Thatcher in the 80s. This, of course, had to be built up over time through the 70s. They had 3 MPs. They controlled the Liverpool City Council. And basically, if it wasn't for the fact that the Labour leader at the time, Neil Kinnock, spent all of his time fighting the actual uprising within his own ranks, because of that, Thatcher got re-elected, and he ended up never getting elected, despite the fact that Thatcher was pretty unpopular through the 80s, yet she kept getting elected. So it literally showed and put on display to a great extent the way that basically the rank and file and the leadership, if you can kind of conceive those as dialectical opposites, they're not on the same level. And a lot of people will often dismiss in an abstract way parties based on this kind of idea. It's like, oh, Do you see that they have such and such a leader? Ah, it sucks, it's not worth it. But you always have to ask, who's the rank and file in the parties? What does the party structure itself, and what is its historical traditions? This being the case, the Labour Party does have, you know, a history of Marxism with it, open Marxism. Granted, you can go back and read what Lenin wrote about them in the 1910s, 1920s, and he criticizes them very harshly. And all of it's still true today, probably more so. But it doesn't change the fact that that's where the masses and the working class are oriented towards, at least predominantly. So Grant's success was a failure, though. They had the 3 MPs, Liverpool City Council, and the tide rolled back. New Labour came in. Particularly, there was a split within Grant's own tendency. Some of you might be familiar with the CWI, maybe for the Workers' International, led by a prominent man named Pierre Taffy. But they were working together and they split, and it was literally a split over this very issue of, do we stay in the Labour Party despite the fact they're trying to kick us out? And of course, every single minute and all the time they spend trying to eliminate you from this position is just another opportunity to raise your rank and profile. Because chances are, you know, most rank and file members of the Social Democratic Party like their, you know, leftist Marxists that they're working with, such that when the axe comes down, that'll prompt them to say, hey, these guys are perfectly nice guys. I worked with them, I share a lot of the ideals. It gets them to question their own allegiance to Social Democratic Labour Party. So Grant basically said, you're throwing away 30 years of work, 20 years of work by leaving the Labour Party and splitting. But that's what happened. They're now, I guess they had some success in Scotland. They've been able to get 1 or 2 MPs elected or something like that. But they became the Socialist Party, and nothing's really happened since then. I'd like to keep an open mind and hope that these Marxists can still go on to do something valuable or interesting. But as it is, Ted Grant started Socialist Appeal. He lost the vote in terms of splitting, like 93% to 7%. But I'd like to also put that forward as proof, basically, that often people will say all Trotskyist sects or all Trotskyist groupings are authoritarian, Zinovievite, etc. Ted Grant got kicked out of his own party, you know? He's kind of like the Trotsky of Trotskyism, you know? Because continuously, like, getting elbowed out of the organization that he's a part of. And granted, that's not a great tradition because you're kind of losing continuously. You're always in the minority of a minority. But perhaps it's better to be that than to, you know, completely compromise yourself by resorting to counter-revolutionary and bureaucratic tactics of a Stalinist or Zinoviev type. But that basically brings us up to the present. Grant died, and he became politically inactive in 2003, died in 2006. And this year, in fact, is the Ted Grant centenary. This is his 100th anniversary of his birthday. And sometimes reading Ted Grant can be a bit trying, a little bit. He has a kind of a very specifically British style. It's that type of wit and irony that you can't pick up on until you really like read it closely and you realize, oh, he's actually savaging this person in a critique when it presents itself as actually just kind of like basic. And Lenin had this too. Lenin was very ironic if you can really look at the way that he wrote sometimes. But I would just recommend checking out, I have a couple of books over there, some of the publications at the literature table. Like I can just go on and talk about Ted Grant, whatever, but at this point I think it's just better to give it a chance yourself and give it a read. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about, I guess, is the IMT's overall strategy, though, overall approach to various issues in the world today, not only Canada, but specifically a situation like Venezuela. I imagine already, because I've had to have some question and answers with people, that people have probably heard about the IMT stance on Venezuela. Alan Woods, who's kind of like the successor of Ted Grant, started a campaign called Hands Off Venezuela, specifically in relation to the way that you can literally there was just a WikiLeaks just the other day where they talked about how there was an active campaign by the United States government to undermine the Venezuelan government under Chavez. And say what you want about Chavez, he's not a socialist and he's not a Marxist. We'll be the first to admit that. But if you look once again, it's not so much the leader, but where are the masses? Where are the peasants and the working class? Who's going to defend the Bolivarian Revolution now that Chavez is gone? I don't necessarily have faith that Maduro will, considering that he has ties to the Cuban bureaucracy that's trying to flip Cuba capitalist. Once, of course, the Castro's brother dies. But at the same time, what about these politically mobilized masses who literally were engaged by Chavez? They didn't necessarily vote for Chavez in the first election, but once he got into power, he invested money in them. He brought them into cities. He even went so far to arm them in certain corridors and areas. Now, are they just going to give up without a fight, especially after making all of these gains due to Chavez? Basically, by just presenting this, like I know there will probably be more questions than answers about this kind of thing, but I encourage people to think about the Venezuela question, not so much about just Chavez good or bad, and I guess this is even maybe a moot question now considering that he's passed away, but think about the masses, and that's once again Ted Grant's ultimate lesson. You can almost conceive it dialectically between leader, party, class. You know, you have the universal class, the particular party, and the singular leader. You know, ultimately, we reject those kind of anarchist analyses or direct democratic analyses that kind of say that, oh, we're all leaderful. You know, we'll just have a kind of like a groovy working togetherness without and just be able to kind of make a revolutionary movement that way. We're going to need leaders. I don't think there's any way of getting around that, because basically if you take leaders out of the equation, you just get backdoor leaders, people coordinating things behind the scenes, and you have less democracy that way. What you need is democratically accountable leaders. We're for democratic centralism. I know this gets abused once again because all the various Trotskyist sects will say, oh, we're democratic centralism, and then once again you see the Stalinist and Zinoviev tactics that they apply. But we're going to need democratic leaders going forward. But we're going to need an organized party apparatus, for sure. Granted, a party's a big thing. Right now we describe ourselves as the International Marxist Tendency. There's a difference between a tendency and a party. It's really just admitting our own objective weakness in relation to the forces of capital and the situation at hand. We're a tendency trying to make a party. And I know there's other groups out there that are trying to do the same and see themselves as a kind of pre-party formation. That's appropriate because things objectively, until you actually have a mass revolutionary party, you just have to admit that you're working up to that point. But these kind of values that are discussed by Lenin and Trotsky, and too often now I fear in the 21st century with the way that things are seen, it's almost like they're unfashionable more than wrong, you know? Like I find some people will say, oh, you know, Stalinism is inherently present within any kind of Bolshevik or Bolshevism practice. The original sin of Bolshevism, so to speak. But I don't know, I think that's theological thinking. We can reject an idea of original sin within the Bolshevik party. Basically, I would encourage people here to think about organization as something more than just education, you know? Because we're going to need organization in terms of accountability to a party structure to go forward. But we're also going to need it in terms of agitation. Once again, where are the masses? The masses, you know, less than half of people go to university, already right there. And chances are those that do go to university will find themselves associating with a kind of, they'll be middle class, petit bourgeois, essentially. You know, it's not a rule. Clearly there's people come from all over to go to university. But what are those academic Marxists and what are the Marxists who focus first and foremost on education and cadre building in that sense? How are they going to win over the masses? You know, masses to a certain extent are ready to strike. Look at the Chicago teachers, you know, and think how are the teachers going to react with these school closings that are coming now. There are huge gains to be made by engaging these movements. Huge gains, you know. People are ready to fight. I think too often people kind of have this idea of the working class that, oh, they're lazy, they just want to watch television, there's something missing, there's some kind of elements that they had back then that we don't have now. Well, remember Zizek says, for example, that the fundamental way ideology works is that it constructs itself like the fall. It was good back then, and then something disrupted it, and now we are where we are, and we can't get back there, you know? I think there's probably just as much sectarianism and stuff like that back 100 years ago as there is today. People may be seemingly more confused today in terms of the way that history gets reinterpreted for the present, because sometimes it can be very abstract and very difficult to deal with. But I'd just like to encourage everyone here, aside from checking out the literature that we have to kind of explains these ideas more thoroughly, but to take seriously the idea of agitation. I'm using these three words: education, agitation, agitation, education. What was the other one?
Propaganda?
No, propaganda counts as education.
Organizing?
Yeah, organizing. That's embarrassing. But agitation, if you're not agitating amongst the working class, if you're not going to go out there and engage, get out of your comfort zone. If you're not going to go out and get out of your comfort zone, then how are we going to organize something that is truly massive, you know? Anyways, those three phrases, though, are traditionally in Trotskyist literature. You'll see slogans: educate, agitate, organize, things like that. But I think it's a really good just kind of go-to three-word phrase of what Marxism should be. Now, I admire the Platypus group very much because I think their attitude towards education needs to be, celebrated. We need to read. We need to go back to these original texts particularly. We need to engage. Like Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, I'd say it's just as true today as it is back then. Sure, things are a little bit more sophisticated with the manipulation of finance capital, but the overall dynamic of imperialism being defined as the export of capital is still going on today. But once again, there's an attitude that says, oh, we need something new, we need novelty, a new Marxism for a new era. I would rather say that the new comes out of the way that the old gets stuck and doesn't go away. That's literally how you can create a space that's truly, truly new, is by being able to reconcile history with the present in a way that's productive. We can't jettison history. We have to live up to this history. And I especially say that if anyone else in the room identifies as a so-called Trotskyist or Leninist, we really do have to account for the history of Stalinism. We need to know it like the back of our hand, because once again, engaging with working class, regular people that may not have heard of really Marxism before, they say, oh, but the Soviet Union was terrible under Stalinism. We need to be able to have that conversation and explain exactly what happened, And this is just, I think, our historical responsibility as Marxists at this point. But anyways, how am I doing for time?
A couple minutes and we'll get to Q&A.
Okay, that sounds good. One more thing I wanted to share, maybe a little equation, is the way that classically you have, and this is more personally than what the IMT says, you have theory and praxis, The theses on Feuerbach, the philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point, however, is to change it. And you get this kind of very vulgarized version of like, oh, enough theory, we need the praxis. I feel, though, that this has been really vulgarized recently. People either err too far to one side, or they err too far to the other. I don't think I think it's a fair criticism to say that the ISO Cliffite tendency is much more, they jettison theory for the sake of praxis, to jump on board with the movement. But with theory and praxis, I feel these get reflected into each other, such that you have a theory of theory, a theory of praxis, a praxis of theory, and a praxis of praxis. This equation basically puts education first and foremost, because all three of these count as something as education, whereas praxis is praxis. That's kind of your much more rugged, organize the people, go out to the picket line, have the conversations, invest the hours, But theory of theory, what we see with this is like, if you're going to read Marxist Capital, that's kind of what I would count as more like theory of theory, because you're going to get into the economic forms, history, etc. Lenin and Trotsky, on the other hand, I think are much more something that I consider theory of praxis. Now, granted, Lenin and Trotsky both also write about economics. They have more Trotsky writes about morals and art and stuff like that. But when they're writing about practice and how to apply these methods, that's what's most valuable, I think, from Lenin and Trotsky. The praxis of theory, this is like what the Platypus group does as an organization. It gets people together and actually puts, once again, hours, the work and time in to get people reading and engage these texts. We have reading groups too, of course, with the IMT. Our curriculum tends to be more around those classic Marxist authors that I've already mentioned. This equation right here, and the way that Grant kind of stands in for it. The reason I set it up like this is because arguably you could just read this and come to the same conclusions that Grant did. But since Trotsky died in 1938 and Grant lived till 2006, it really helps to kind of bridge the gap over what happened after World War II, which is still kind of what we're recovering from in a kind of way. So it's not that, once again, grant is not some kind of God, will the rest fall to the wayside. It's actually quite the opposite. But without praxis of praxis, though, to get back to this point, without this, I feel that the metaphor I use is that it's like we're in a boat with a motor in the water without a propeller. We can get the motor going as fast and as high as we want, but we're not going to make any ground unless we're ready to actually intervene and invest the hours. Sacrifice. It's not a sexy word. It's not a sexy word, but we need to be prepared to make sacrifices to push this movement forward. Individually, you have to ask, how can I contribute? You know? And of course, part of that is individual cadre building. Build yourself up, educate yourself. But also, we can't just be abstract Marxists. We have to be concrete Marxists. And we have to be ready to have that conversation, even if it's comfortable or uncomfortable outside of our comfort zone, with the workers, the masses of society. I think it's only with a perspective like this that we really will be able to build for the future. Now, it's intimidating. It's a mountain. I'd say it's like climbing a mountain, because that fits in with metaphors that Marx has used, where he said there's no royal road to the dialectic, but it's only those who cling to the mountain who will be able to reach the luminous summit. Likewise, Lenin used a metaphor of climbing a mountain and then having to beat a retreat in relation to the Soviet Union. It's a great text called On Ascending a High Mountain by Lenin. But it is only with this attitude of making progress, climbing the mountain, that we'll be able to reach the luminous summit. And so I encourage you to, I don't know, join me in mountain climbing. And I'll leave it at that, I guess. Thank you.
So I'd just like to ask one kind of question, and then we'll just have other interventions from the floor. I think to kind of clarify the issue of entryism, which is something that you've mentioned in terms of your organization's orientation towards what you characterize as the mass organizations of the working class.
Mm-hmm.
So the tagline of Fight Back, the magazine, is NDP to power on a socialist program.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a feasible option, or is it this more a rhetorical device to influence, you know, what you would perceive as the radical or the potential radical members of the New Democratic Party?
It's akin to a transitional demand. Trotsky wrote about transitional demands in the 1930s, but it's the idea that you formulate a demand that makes free education. Other countries have it, it's great, there's no reason why we shouldn't have it, but under the capitalist system as it currently exists, it's seemingly impossible, you know, especially when we're seeing in the age of austerity, nothing but cuts. Cuts, cuts, cuts. There's no way they're going to invest in education, despite the fact that from a very, very rational perspective, it's completely possible, completely. So by saying NDP to power on a socialist program, it's like calling for free education, just in relation to the context of the Canadian political spectrum. It's also kind of similar to, I think, a lot of people familiar with Leninology, I guess you could say, the phrase, all power to the Soviets. What a lot of people, this is one of the transitional demands he made, demands politically, that pushed the revolution forward at a decisive stage in 1917. And what a lot of people don't know, though, is who ran and controlled the Soviets when he made that phrase, when he said that. It was Mensheviks, not Bolsheviks. He was basically calling them out and saying, you know, you lead us, and let's see where we go. And then it's through that that people can actually see for themselves that they have that leadership. So in calling NDP to power on a socialist program, not only are we kind of holding the NDP to task for being socialists. Right now there's actually a big fight going on. There's going to be the NDP convention next weekend, and they're trying to take the word socialism out of the Constitution. This happened also, I think, a couple of years ago. So this is like where we're at right now with the NDP, how far right it's gone. It's literally trying to like extinguish its history and just become the new Liberal Party. But there's still unions and a lot of people that want to fight for that word, you know? So we're calling out the NDP basically on claiming to, at one point, be socialists, also on the history, as we said, coming from the CCF and celebrating this. It's a much more radical anti-capitalist perspective than what they present now. But it's also constructive in the way that it's saying NDP to power. Yes, this is better than the liberals and conservatives, but at the same time, you know, unless it's going to deliver on socialism, it's just going to be, it's going to be very problematic, and in some ways it could even be worse. So basically, that's at least the way I see the slogan there.
Can I follow that?
Sorry, Tom, actually.
I just want to follow that up. First, I mean, thank you for the talk, and I actually have read some Ted Grant and have it. So I want to follow up the question of entryism.
Yeah.
And also talk about it from the American. So, two questions. One is, I mean, Trotsky in the 30s, when he talks about French turn and entrism, it's basically from perspective of splitting. But post-war Trotskyists, not necessarily both the Grant tendency and others like Pavlos who have different ideas, very different, I'm not comparing them, they tended to see entrism as a longer-term strategy, not an immediate tactic. That's one. And the other question is the NDP really analogous in terms of a class analysis? I mean, one of the arguments that many Trotskyists would have made is that the NDP is not like the Labour Party, that it's not a workers' party, it's just a bourgeois party, it's a left bourgeois party. And looking at the United States, of course, everything is on the left is dominated by the Democratic Party, and where attempts to create a Labour Party seem to have a farcical character when people were trying to do that. I mean, probably the largest party to the left of the Democrats in the United States would be the Greens. So I mean, I guess the question is like, how in an American context, where basically the unions and the working class are in the Democratic Party, where if you had a movement to the left, it would be the Greens, which I don't think anybody really thinks of as the Labour Party or a workers' party. It's clearly some kind of rag-lib, petty, whatever you want to call it. So would you then, I mean, the ISO, for example, here does have an orientation to the Green Party, right? Or it has at times, go back and forth. So I mean, I guess my question is sort of, how does that leave like fighting for socialism in America from that perspective, where you don't have a Labour Party? Does that mean that socialists in America should build a mass reformist Labour Party to then enter? I mean, and as though we could if we wanted to. I mean, obviously we can't. I mean, we don't seem to get. I mean, that sort of leaves is the question. I mean.
I'll deal with it the first part first. Entryism, sui generis, I guess is what it was called. This idea of like working your way up to the top of an organization through secretly going in. This is actually what split the Fourth International the first time, is that you had leaders Pablo and Mandel on one side saying yes, and then others, actually there was other reasons behind this too, but it kind of like, this is one of the things that crystallized the split. Cannon and Healy and a couple others rejected this idea because, quite frankly, it almost becomes like a kind of top secret organization.
Well, that was also an orientation towards Stalinist parties, whereas Grant had an orientation to the Labour Party, which is a very different type of party from Stalin. I understand the difference, but I'm still saying, clearly going into the Labour Party, the idea of that as a strategy, it's not an orientation to splitting the Labour Party, at least not in any immediate perspective. I mean, when Trotsky had his followers go into the Socialist Party, they were there for a couple of years, and they split the left wing. I mean, there was a kind of splitting perspective. So it's obviously a different type of perspective. I mean, you're talking about going into this mass Labour Party, presumably for a period of decades. As long as...
No, but the discussion of splits is actually, like, I guess I didn't focus on that too much. That's much more the perspective, actually, that we have, is that the NDP, quite frankly, if the NDP gets into power, then there's a very good, there's a very likely possibility that they'll just split. Because a lot of people, the NDP have never been in power federally in Canada, and so there's a lot of illusions, as if it would be a big change compared to the Liberals and Conservatives going back and forth. But, you know, say Thomas Mulcair and the NDP get elected in 2015 and end up just kind of being, you know, lame duck, you know, pseudo-socialistic, you know, whatever. You will see a radical revolt, basically, from within the left ranks and the rank and file of the NDP. The question of where that'll go, of course, this is also a hypothetical that'll win the election, but, like, that's much more the perspective we have. Like, we don't believe that the NDP can kind of be taken back or reformed or like turned into a mass revolutionary party.
So you have a different type of thinking about the NDP from the British Labour Party, is what you're saying?
No, but like this is the same perspective about the British Labour Party. The fact of the matter is, though, is that in the UK, nothing has developed outside of this. You know, you still have overall, once again, like where is the mass of society? When most people vote, these votes are going one way or another, you know? And you have to realize that without the masses on your side, you can't compromise principles, but without the masses on your side, there's nothing, you know? Because like, unless you think you're going to be like a Maoist and have like a guerrilla coup against the American military or the British military.
Okay,
Richard,
okay, sorry, didn't make a moment.
Tom?
All right, this actually raised another thing. I hope we can get back to this here. But so the question I was going to ask is, I appreciate the diagram, the equation that's been used here, but so sort of the point, not to just make a pedantic point of the Lukasz's essay, what is orthodox Marxism, isn't just that there's this sort of disordered collection of elements, right? There's sort of to use the set theoretical language here, there's a common property that defines their membership, and this is the adherence to a specific method, a certain theory of history that constitutes Marxism, right? And I noticed very significantly you drew the G for Ted Grant outside of the brackets of this set. So, you know, like what's the theory of history at work here? Anyway, I mean, like I actually by chance happen to have a really good quote from, you alluded to a Ted Grant essay, Will There Be a Slum? It's a complete chance I have this one quote he's talking about in the essay was trying to sort of disprove the idea that there would be some economic slump after World War II and that there would in fact be some type of sort of reconcrescence of capitalism. And the quote he states is, such periods, these reconcrescences, are inevitable so long as the working class, through faulty leadership, fails to end the system. There's no such thing as the last crisis. So the question I would ask is, you know, how does Ted Grant help you conceptualize and explain the fact that the working class has, by its own sort of explanation, failed for 150 years or so? Without, you know, in a way that somehow complement, I mean, you said that there's some necessity to interpreting the figures in these brackets here through Ted Grant that otherwise we don't, you know, we would be lost. So what is it that he adds?
The most important thing I think that Ted Grant adds is a kind of clarity in interpretation, because the thing is, one of the ways I've actually phrased it before, it would have been more helpful maybe for me to say this. If Trotsky stands as a kind of positive thesis, and then Trotskyism, the Fourth International, is a negation of that thesis, then Ted Grant's a kind of negation of the negation. So it actually, Ted Grant is the kind of rejection of the bad Trotskyist history that actually is kind of anti-Trotskyist in a lot of ways, insofar as I said before, it has a Zinovievite and Stalinist ways of organizing, and it takes that for granted. What Ted Grant does is allows us basically to not just throw Trotsky in the garbage, just because of the way that it was mishandled by so many of the Fourth Internationalists. It's one of the books that Ted Grant's called, it's called The Unbroken Thread. It's this idea that there is this kind of thread going through history of a genuine Marxist tendency, genuine methods of organizing, and understanding history, as you say, that are really important. Now, specifically, we mentioned already how Ted Grant predicted and saw the capitalist boom after World War II, whereas the rest of them thought it was World War III and the return of fascism up until 1953. And also how Ted Grant saw China for what it was. He said that Mao will model his government after Stalinism, while the rest were calling him an unconscious Trotskyist, and basically looking towards Mao as the leader of the revolution, which quite frankly is a capitulation to Stalinism. So the Fourth International, even in a very explicit way, capitulated to Stalinism. The third one is he also understood the colonial revolution, Algeria, etc. I'm not as familiar about specifically his writings on that, but he does make these theoretical contributions over time. And then finally, there's the example, so-called the praxis of praxis, which is the militant tendency in the 80s. Now that's where I'm much more willing to be kind of like harshly critical towards Grant, because it did fail, but it shows that this mode of organizing is capable of gaining ground, you know. The thing is, as opposed to just kind of flailing in nowhere, you know, and not making, and just like finding yourself year after year in the same place, not gaining anything. What Ted Grant did prove was that you can actually make significant gains and have an impact on the class struggle. If it wasn't for Ted Grant and the anti-poll tax campaign, Thatcher would have still been in government after 1991, which is I think when she stepped down. I'm not sure if that's exactly right in terms of years, but the militant tendency led the anti-poll tax campaign, where a third of Britons didn't pay their taxes on the poll tax, and Thatcher had to resign. So this form of organizing can have a very immediate impact on the lives of the working class.
But the question, okay, so take like a concrete example. I don't know about the IMT's activities in Canada, but I have a good amount of experience with the IMT's activities through the will here in the United States, and their campaign explicitly is a campaign for a mass party of labor.
Yeah.
So this is the question I'm asking, is like, labor parties don't exist in the US. There is no labor party, right? And this is the question that
Well, why
Richard
would they
brought
be
up
calling
earlier.
for it if there was one?
Well, presumably they'd be entering it if there was one.
Yes, I mean, they wouldn't have to do it, but this is the point, is I'm trying to like, this in some way calls into question the whole, the viability of the politics that you're advocating, and I just, like, how does Grant or Woods or the IMT or the Will, any of these sort of, whatever we're referring to, you're representing here, how are you able to account for this in a way that doesn't just render this like, to me it has this almost like irrational quality to it, like, well, the conditions don't exist for what we want to do, so conditions be damned, we're going to make them, right? So how are you able to how are you able to understand this like complete dark of the conditions for the practical politics you want to advocate, and how I've never gotten any type of like concrete explanation of how, because this seems to be like right in this quote here, right? Is there some acknowledgement that, well, nothing's ever going to be better as long as the working class continues to fail, and it has failed. Can we get some type of explanation of this?
Well, the failure of the working class can be treated as an abstract question. It fails in certain places, in certain struggles, historically, geographically, but particularly to the American context. And this is, of course, why even at the very beginning of my presentation, I kind of wished some of these socialist appeal guys were here, because they can specifically speak to this. But what is there outside of this? Like, there are no shortcuts necessarily. What part of my using the metaphor of the mountain and stuff like that is to say that there's.
Don't imagine.
Guys, just so we can keep some sort of semblance of order in this conversation. And like, I know it is because there are a lot of Americans in this room, and because obviously what happens in the United States. Yes, exactly. But
We have our.
Noah is here representing Fight Back as the International Marxist Tendency, and their organization does have a certain division of labor on an international scale. So I know it kind of limits things to keep things specifically to Canada. I don't want to do that. I like talking about the organization's theory and history. But like the question of specifically the American Labor Party, I think is something that we shouldn't spend the whole remaining half hour.
I had a separate question, which is connected to like how one judges success. So certainly I would agree that the militant tendency was the largest Trotskyist group in British history at its peak. However, that peak obviously was defeated. And then the question would be, okay, does that make that tendency more successful than, say, the socialist workers, which I'm not sympathetic to. But I'm saying, like, okay, the socialist people who are supporters of the Socialist Workers' Party and the tendency of Tony Cliff could say, well, like, we created this mass party, and it's not really a mass party compared to the Labor Party, outside of, and, it's still going, like, stronger than, so I guess the question is how are you measuring success? Like, by the standards of the United States, tens of thousands of members of militant tendency at its peak, that's huge, but still, the reality is that when pitted with the forces of the Labor Party bureaucracy, it was pretty quickly defeated. And I guess sort of the question is, why is that clearly then a better strategy than, say, the strategy of the Socialist Workers' Party or any number of parties that operate out? We have people here from the CPGB, which is much tinier, of course. But why is that clearly better to work within that mass party? Even if you get like large numbers, is that per se a success? You mentioned the poll tax, and the image I had was, okay, but that's kind of like the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States taking credit for the anti-war movement. It's true the biggest anti-war movement was kind of led by the Socialist Workers' Party, acting as kind of, I mean, that's not really a radical, you know what I'm saying? I guess the question is how one judges success in this category.
It wasn't a success, I'll just say that. No, if insofar as the goal was power, it failed. Yeah, you have to be just sober and admit it, and you learn from the mistakes. What I'm trying to say more with the militant tendency is that it gives us a prototype for going forward, though. The fact is that this kind of mode of organizing can show promise of success, basically. And if it wasn't for arguably mistakes made in the movement, particularly there's two big mistakes that come to my mind. In 1987, there was a kind of a quick little slump, glitch on the map, so to speak, because it was recovered from very quickly. But Ted Grant said, this is it. This is the crisis. And what he was basically talking about is the crisis that we're experiencing right now, because what happened then is very, to a certain extent irrationally, capitalists doubled down on credit to keep a boom going as opposed to starting a boom. And that's why the crisis that we're going to experience right now going forward is going to be worse off than it would have been if, so to speak, that never happened. And granted, there are still some things that happened in '87 insofar as Japan has not recovered since 1987. And on the world capitalist system, like it is a decisive date to a certain extent. But yes, it mystified a lot of people, and people got confused when Ted Grant said, this is the crisis, and then prosperity keeps going. So he kind of has a way of explaining like, oh, but this is how they were able to do it, but it definitely caused confusion in the movement. The second problem, though, of course, is the way that the Taffy tendency broke apart the militant tendency, or they claim to be militant now, but just the way that it broke apart. And as I said, Ted Grant saw that as saying you're throwing away years and years of work, because the point is to build these historical traditions, not just so much that you have like huge numbers at any given time, but the way that this history can become reactivated. As Marx writes about in the 18th Brumaire, you know, these symbols and signs and the clothing of the past get picked up again for the revolution. Granted, he's specifically describing the bourgeois revolution, but I almost feel there's a weird way that gets inverted now, and especially if you look at how people will have their like Soviet Union pins and have their Lenin shirts and stuff. But literally, like these figures become mythic almost on the stage of history, but without making that history there to begin with, then you don't have that bank to draw on. So I'm not trying to kind of get back to what you're saying. I'm not trying to say this was a success. You know, in a lot of ways, Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution was not a success, insofar as international socialism is the goal. No one has succeeded in this yet. And if you're going to look at specifically just advanced capitalist countries, likewise, no one has succeeded at this yet. This mountain has yet to be climbed. It's a virgin peak, I guess you could call it. But that being the case, I feel we can't really criticize Grant too harshly when it's the case that no one else has done this yet, you know. We're at the kind of point of hypothesis and figuring out the way to go forward. I would just argue that there's a lot of promise and a lot more to be gained from having this orientation towards the mass and not necessarily the left. And that's, I think, what separates Ted Grant's tendency from a lot of the other Trotskyist groups in existence.
Actually, my question's been answered. So.
There you go. Yeah, I'll ask another question about actually Venezuela, because
Sure.
you alluded to that in your conversation. Your tendency has been extremely supportive of Chavez's government. And there have been the criticisms it's made, but it seems to me that there's a bit of a similarity between the way it approaches the question of Chavez's organizations and what you kind of alluded to in terms of like the Pabloites and the way that they approached the seemingly imminently successful communist parties of Europe, as in burrowing inside and hoping to have influence instead of trying to provoke a split or trying to do like the sort of classical Trotskyist mode of entryism. So I was just wondering if you could kind of speak a little more about the IMT's actual approach to Venezuela solidarity and what sort of like potential future you would like to see in Venezuela. Like, do you think your tendency could eventually have like some sort of executive influence there, or what's the game plan?
Well, I guess our attachment to Venezuela, first and foremost, It's the campaign was founded by Alan Woods. Who he's since Ted Grant has died, Alan Woods has kind of come to the fore as a major leadership figure within the IMT. Grant and Woods even wrote multiple books together, so there's no question about an unbroken thread there. But his relationship to Chavez has been interesting because it's not like Alan Woods is some kind of like cabinet advisor or something like that. We might have met a couple times, I think, you know. But in some of the nationalizations, apparently, the Venezuelan government did. According to Woods, talking about what Chavez told him, it was because of Woods' influence. So the idea that Chavez might have got to power originally seeing himself more as just like the liberal bourgeois democratic revolution that never came to Venezuela, the fact that that might have gone further towards socialism, that's, I think, what the IMT can at least partially claim credit for, you know, of pushing Chavez actually farther than he might have gone otherwise. Now still, as we said, there was a lot left to be desired with the Bolivarian Revolution, and at the same time, it'll be interesting to see where things develop going forward. There potentially can be very tragic, you know, but there are huge gains to be made as well. But we have people in Venezuela, because insofar as the IMT is an international organization with 40 countries or so, they're in the PSUV, so that's the main Chavez party. And the idea, like, but it's not like there's necessarily many of them. We're supportive of the revolution insofar as we're supportive of any revolution. The Arab Spring, you know. We don't necessarily have anyone in Egypt at all, I don't think. But at the same time, we're completely behind that revolution because we're for the masses, you know. The idea that the people can take their lives and their society and their economic production into their own hands is a fundamental tenet of Marxism. And insofar as we witness this happening anywhere, I think ultimately, you know, there are of course some exceptions, but like if you have some kind of national socialist nationalization or something like that, you clearly have to stand against it. But on the whole, when you see this, the masses take to the streets and seize on their own accord certain, you know, public property or private properties and turn them public, that's I think what we need to get behind and support. And so it's been much more this side of the Venezuelan revolution that I think that we've been always trying to focus on. That and the fact that if you look at the way that the advanced capitalist countries have responded to Venezuela, insofar as they're terrified, you know, they want to nip it in the bud, stomp down on it. What does that tell us, though, about how capitalists see the potential of the Venezuelan revolution? Because if it wasn't remotely socialist, or it wasn't even like, didn't have any of this kind of a tendency in it, then the capitalists would just be ignoring it, right? You know, but the fact that they've responded so, because if you watch the American media on Venezuela, you think he's like Saddam Hussein times 100 or something like that, you know, some kind of.
Let me ask you a question about that. I was actually in Argentina when Chavez died. So I was watching Argentine TV. It was 24/7, very laudatory. So again, my question is like, okay, Argentina is maybe not an advanced capitalist, it's not the imperialist hegemon, but there does not seem to be any anxiety among the Argentine bourgeoisie about Venezuela, or generally in Latin America. I mean, people treated Venezuela generally with a kind of curious indifference. I mean, the president made a state visit. I mean, so I guess my sense, like watching that, was Chavez doesn't seem to be a great threat to capitalism in Latin America. And the American left, or maybe seems to be sort of parroting the U.S. State Department hysteria, but in reverse. I mean, that was my sense. Like, well, it's just another, you know, Argentine left populist nationalist government.
Oh, well.
I mean, maybe that sounds to you too dismissive, but watching the TV coverage on the regular and reading the papers, regular bourgeois media, I'm not talking about left media, and seeing about the state visit, I just couldn't feel that this was some sort of radical development. I mean, that was just sort of my visceral response. I was just sort of shocked at how normalized and positive it was.
And like, but aside from the television, was there much outpouring on, like, in Argentina about it? Was there kind of, because I even know just in Toronto, though, we have still been having events about Chavez in Venezuela to this right now, and we got 100 people coming out to these things, you know, like every single event. So the way that the masses specifically, I'm not sure about television programming, but the way that people have responded towards the death of Chavez, it's been a huge outpouring of support. Like granted, a lot of it's very romantic, but I think we have to be prepared to kind of see, likewise with the romance of it, the way that there's murals of Che Guevara everywhere, you know, and he's just become this kind of folk hero. This is going to happen with Chavez, I think, going forward, and it doesn't speak necessarily to anything he did, but the way that he went out, and it just shows this burning desire that I think a lot of people have for something different.
But people in the U.S., sorry, just to interrupt, but people in the U.S. were like crying that way over Steve Jobs is dying. I mean, I'm not sure, you know, like having like, you know, popular figures, like people can be popular for all sorts of reasons. It doesn't necessarily say anything about their politics. Although Steve Jobs, you might say, represented the like rising forces of production or something. So in some crypto-Marxist sense, he really was.
Packaging.
There's no reason for Chavez to be popular though outside of politics, you know. So the thing is, specifically for like political reasons, though.
Well, in part because he was a strong man who, you know, spoke back to the United States and made Venezuela feel like a powerful nation.
No, I mean, I agree about Latin American nationalism, but I just don't see that as like particularly left. I guess that's my sense is, yes, of course there was a lot of sympathy.
Yeah.
I mean, we were traveling with some Peruvians who were, you know, semi-Maoist, to be honest, and they were like, oh yes, this is a terrible thing. But, you know, and then I was talking to like people, ordinary middle-class Argentinians, who were like, you know, I mean, it was just this sort of like non-hysteria, but also not like, it didn't, like on the one hand it seemed like a much bigger thing, but on the other hand it also seemed like a much smaller thing. Like it seemed like much more ordinary.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, the head of state who was popular in Latin America, he died. You know, it's like somebody famous dies and there's a lot of news, Michael Jackson or the Pope or whatever. It didn't, like I guess the sense is that I feel, and this goes back to the question of politics, is I feel that Chavez has been magnified politically because there's relatively little happening. That, you know, a few decades ago, people would have looked at the Sandinistas, who were much more radical than Chavez, and before that, they would have looked to Fidel Castro, who was much more radical than the Sandinistas. So I feel like this is this sort of lowering of expectations of what constitutes radicalism, and that sort of what basically seems to me like run-of-the-mill Latin America. Like, what's the real difference between Chavez and Evo Morales, for example? Or, you know, even at a lesser level, you have people like, you know, like in Brazil and Argentina, and what's the guy in Uruguay, you know, who gives away most of his salary. I mean, there are a lot of sort of left of center or left nationalist Latin American leaders. You know, Argentina supposedly has a sort of semi-leftish leader, but the reality, I just feel like there's this way of like projecting onto it. I mean, you spoke about Pabloism. I mean, Tito seems to me like a vastly more radical figure than Chavez, to project some sort of hope on, or Mao, like whatever you think of them, or Castro. Like,
Well, no, before you answer that, actually, Ben Campbell, the question is because we're running low on time, I think.
Yeah, maybe it ties into left nationalism in Latin America, but I wanted to bring the conversation back to Canada. I don't know if it's Fight Back specifically, but the IMT is a tendency within Quebec Solidaire.
Mm-hmm.
We had Quebec Solidaire here yesterday speaking. You probably met Roger Brashi. So I want to know how you reconcile your internationalism with Quebec sovereignty, Quebec nationalism, Quebec Solidaire.
Yeah, no, thanks for actually asking that question. I'll still try and get back to your question, but yeah, I forgot to mention how, I kind of took a base knowledge of Canada for granted. Yeah, Quebec as a province is a Francophile province. It's Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister, has even gone so far to acknowledge that there's two nations in Canada, which of course already ignores First Nations peoples, but like Anglo and French. But this idea is just the politics there in Quebec are radically different. They've tried to separate multiple times. It got as close as a 49% referendum in the 90s. And overall, though, the way that we orient to Quebec politics, though, it works out quite well because there is no provincial NDP. And there's Quebec Solidaire, who's of course like a much more radical left group, although there's still some problems with Quebec Solidaire, I'd argue. So literally the vacuum in the NDP just gets filled by Quebec Solidaire there. And that's why our comrades that are in Quebec orient towards that organization. Something happened, maybe one of the ways to explain it is to invoke Greece. A while ago, the IMT was oriented through PASOK, yet at a certain point a reevaluation had to be made, especially with the startup group of Syriza, originally Synapsimos. So they ditched PASOK and got on board with Syriza. And if they were PASOK now, they would be clearly laughed out of the room as radical leftists, And so sometimes what you have to do is find the smaller group that has room to grow, and especially if it is significantly more radically left than the NDP overall. But in regards to Quebec sovereignty, overall, we're against it. It's a very, Lenin and the Bolshevik position on this kind of thing is very nuanced, because the thing is, arguably, you always have to respect the nation's right to self-determination. That doesn't mean you support it necessarily as a good idea or something that will make the situation better. So for example, Scotland's going to have a referendum very soon about to separate. If it's the case that they pass a referendum of more, everyone wants to separate, then I think it's just an issue where you have to respect that, You can't tell Scotland, in an authoritative way of the people of Scotland what to do. But that doesn't necessarily make it a good idea. It doesn't necessarily mean that the problems that they face today will be solved. And it's the same thing with Quebec. There's a lot of problems that would come up if Quebec actually separates, not geographically to begin with, because there's a bunch of provinces on the east coast of Canada that would literally be separated. So you'd have this weird country separated by another one.
Pakistan.
Yeah, but I guess you're right. Yeah. With yeah.
Or Israel.
No. So basically, we don't support the issue of sovereignty. But if you talk to some of the Quebec comrades, they might have a little bit more nuanced position than I am. I actually had an opportunity to go to Quebec a little while ago and partake in a debate about this, and I was really interested to see how the knee-jerk reaction, I almost want to say, on the left in Quebec is separating. It's just, if you're brought up in a radical position on Quebec, it's of course we're going to separate. Of course we want to separate from Anglo-Canada. But there's a lot of problems that come with that, and I think it's kind of, once you think through it a lot more, and it's also, if you're coming from a Marxist standpoint, there's clearly a lot of problems with the way that the national question distracts from a class question. The most important event in Canada from our radical Marxist standpoint is the 1972 general strike that not only took place in Quebec, but there were also areas in Ontario and New Brunswick where people went out in solidarity. So you had a cross-national strike, at least in terms of French and English, which is very, very significant given the bad blood historically between these two groups, Quebec being oppressed people. So that's
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. This would be from Dana.
This was just a clarification question. When you say if that's what people want to do, you have to respect that. I was just wondering if you could clarify what exactly you mean by that, because it kind of seems like paper over the idea that you would question the nationalism, but then you said that you took part in debates. So
yeah, well, it was even a debate within our section, quite frankly, because we have we're one of the few Marxist Marxist organization in Canada that actually has groups in both Quebec and English-speaking Canada. And so some of my comrades, quite frankly, are separatists, but through a kind of common conversation, we try and reach a kind of consensus. It's through persuasion, which is like classic communism language. But the right to national self-determination, it's written about by Lenin. Yeah, you can go back and read that, and the point is to draw a distinction between just self-determination and the right to self-determination, Marxists always have to respect the right to self-determination, especially when it comes to oppressed peoples, just because that's democratic, If it is the case that an entire population wants to separate or whatever, you have the power to persuade, you have the power to argue and say, no, but ultimately these political events are bigger than just an argument. Words can only do so much if there's already a mass movement going in a certain direction. especially if you're kind of commenting from a sideline, from an Anglo position, you know.
So by respect, you just mean, like, after it's done, that's a done question, or?
I wouldn't say it that way, because the thing is, for example, like if you look at like Yugoslavia, the way that that country broke up into different groups, and then you had huge ethnic conflicts after that, it was clearly a regression. I would argue it was very clearly aggression from under Tito, when you actually had like these national ethnic differences didn't mean anything. They were transparent, and this is what Marxists, you know, should aim for, is something that can see through these petty differences of, you know, race and religion, culture, etc., and see through to a common humanity. So the national question in general is a very complicated question. There actually is no, I would say that there is no single formula that can be applied to every single circumstance. But the idea is just that in terms of right to self-determination, you have to respect it, but in terms of the value of that idea, that's where the debate takes place. And you try and persuade. I would try and persuade everyone I know from Quebec to not vote to separate, you know. So.
Does your American section have a position on Puerto Rico? I'm curious.
I wouldn't know, but
I think it would be similar.
Well, if Puerto Rico, yeah, but the principle applies though. You know?
Right, I understand the principle. I'm just curious if it's ever come up as an issue.
Personally, no. I don't know the first thing about Puerto Rico.
Well, on that note, that's all the time we have. You know, lunch.
Thank you very much, and please feel free to check out the table. Last time John Peterson came and he was like, oh, I don't know if you should go back. We didn't really get any sales, so maybe you can prove him wrong. So, thanks.